how different issues are represented through these media. And through my work with Gillian Bowser and some of the other faculty members involved in climate change and sustainability, sustainable development research, I have gotten more into this general space of climate change and sustainability. I don't know much about climate change and sustainability, so this will be more about the media and gender related issues. So we also have a grant from the National Science Foundation that specifically looks at gender issues in relationship to sustainability. So I guess I'll talk, but it will be more of a smaller interactive session, I hope, and hopefully you will have lots of questions for me. I will have some questions for you in the middle, so. So I'm not sure how much you know about general media theory. So media scholars are very worried about media effects. So what actually happens? Do media have an effect on people? And one of the major theories that media scholars look at is this theory of agenda setting. So this basically says that media, that your traditional news media, are quite powerful in that they do have an influence. They are kind of like gatekeepers because they decide what information is actually represented on TV, on the radio, in the newspapers. And hopefully it has something to do with the real world. I mean, they cannot completely make things up, although I'm sure you can think of some movies that have claimed otherwise. But we assume that there's hopefully these are not your kind of tabloid papers, the real news media. They look at the reality, but they still make choices because they have to make economic choices. If you think about TV space, newspaper space, radio space, it's limited. So they decide what they can report on and what is more important. So the idea is that whatever is presented in the media does have an influence on the public and what the public thinks about. So it's not what they think, it's not telling you what opinion you should have, but it does put certain things high on the agenda. If you think about news media currently, I'm not sure, but I guess the agenda now is probably about the government. This is like everywhere, the lockdown, there's not much else on the news. I'm originally from Europe. I always felt that in the US, I was at Texas A&M for many years. It was a much more US-centric focus with a couple of things that were US related that were reported, but it was not necessarily international media. So very different for me what I was used to. And what is kind of then important for us also, especially in this climate change issues, then there's an assumption that this will determine policy and what gets discussed by the policy. So in this context of media effects and agenda setting, media scholars also talk about framing, and that was in the title of my talk, so it's a central issue that I want to talk about. So frame is a central organizing idea. It's how you define an issue. In the context of media, in a negative sense, it's sometimes called spin. So it's the way you present, the way you frame. It's really like a picture, think of it. The frame you put around that picture does make a difference. It's still the same picture, but the way it looks is very different depending on that frame. So it is about making certain aspects more salient than others. Doesn't mean that the others aren't reported, but there's just more emphasis on certain aspects. And this really helps or suggests to viewers or readers how to interpret and discuss events, issues. So there is an assumption that these frames influence the opinions because they stress certain values, certain facts more than others. And so it is a decision that as a medium, as an editor, as a journalist, you make in terms of how you present. And then we assume that also because of this, people have certain frames in their mind. So when we talk about audience frames, it's more of the cognitive structures that they have, the schemas. So it's kind of like the best picture I could find. But we have a general idea of what an animal looks like, and we have a general idea of what a dog looks like specifically, right? We don't always have to do a very deep thinking process. We see something, kind of know a dog has 4 legs, it has a certain it has a tail, it has fur. So we have the schema and we apply it to that. So if you think about climate change, then people have certain ideas of what climate change is, what matters, what's important about it, what they really when they see news, they would then think, okay, that's a climate change issue. Well, that's the question: are they going to think that way? And the same thing for gender issue. What do people think about when you say gender? What are the schemas that they have when you say gender representation or whatever? So people have actually done quite a bit of research on climate change specific frames. And some of the research that I found says there's a clear frame that is all about really alarming people. This notion of urgency, we have to do something that is out there. There's also some spatial frames. So is this an international issue, or is this something that we here in Fort Collins have to worry about? And these frames can actually also change. So I found one study that showed that the Bush government, for example, in the Clinton government, it was much more framed as an international issue and something that people really we had to think about in a global sense and blah, blah, blah. And then the Bush government played that down. So there's also framing by the politicians, the campaigns, the Senate, the House, and the debates. There is a lack of scientific fact, and if you think about media, they are corporations, and they need to make money, and they are likely to present whatever sells, whatever gets them views. So they're much more focused on human interest stories related to climate change. So I'm sure that with the flooding that you guys just had, there was a lot more about this human interest kind of this one guy saved another guy kind of story, because that is what people or people in general, what media think people want. So there's a big focus on extreme weather events and this language of terror, but people in the media communications realm have argued that that is actually not good for policy making, because it leads to this paralysis where really it's so bad and it's out of control, we can't do anything about it. And unfortunately, I think in the US, but also in some other countries, it has become a partisan issue. And now that, I don't know if you've heard that Australia just had elections, and now the new government is all about getting rid of the carbon tax, saying that that was really a policy, an issue that was a Labour Party thing, and not of general concern to Australia. It was really something that they assigned to the Labour Party. So unfortunately, that is very much the case. All right, so I'm very interested in studying social media. How does social media fit into this? Well, social media is a big group of all sorts of media tools, Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and YouTube, you name it. But what they have in common is that they are built on this technological foundation that is all about creation of user content. If you think about Web 1.0, you had to have technical expertise. You needed to know a programming language to actually create a website. Social media is all about allowing a general person to put content online and consume other people's contents very easily. So you have news feeds, you have people's likes showing up, and you also see social networks in some of these applications. So what's the political power of social media? We have seen, especially in the Middle East, that there are some opportunities for more democratic uses. So in Iran, people were able to use Twitter to communicate and to organize. So from a political perspective, that's now, I guess, the great promise of social media. So some people even talk about citizen media now being especially supported through social media, where technically everyone can participate. It's a real democracy because it's open, and that means that these social media now are becoming networks of influence. If you think about it yourself, I'm not sure if you still read your newspaper at home in a paper format, or if you turn on the computer and read maybe a newspaper online, or sometimes even I get my news from Facebook because I just see all my friends posting about it. So that's really, I think, a trend that we have to watch and really think about what does that mean for climate change and also for gender in this context. So if you think about climate change and animals, for example, here's a small study, and I think it was done a couple of years ago, so it's not very recent. Are social media actually different in the way they report? And so this is the general web, Google search on climate change and animal whatever. And you see here that it's, there's your usual suspects, I guess, but interesting, eagle and dolphin, for example, pretty big here. You have the red fox, whale, panda, so we have lots of animals here. Then we have the news. So this is media. Before it was websites, general websites. It could be conservation agencies, whatever. This now is news. And you see here already polar bear, big issue. But we still have a couple of other things. And then we have the social media, the blogosphere. So your bloggers and polar bear, and then maybe a couple of other things. But really, I'm not sure about cows.
Yeah.
Is that more like cows impacting climate change due to methane?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, could be. Yeah. Yes.
We don't really think.
So, but clearly you see here, here's a frame. Here's also, it seems that the social media in this case are not so different from the media that but then also this is just blogs. This is not your Twitter. And if you think about blogs, there's still a lot of journalists who run blogs, so it's not as far away from your general media sources than maybe we would think. Anyway, so this whole animal issue is very much centered on the polar bear in the social media space. So then within our grant and also for my presentation today, the question is really how are issues related to climate change, sustainability, and gender then conceptualized or framed by different groups or different media? So the question is it an issue, or should we really only worry about the polar bears? Do people actually talk about gender in this context, and how do they talk about it? So the grant that we are working on is really about building a network of women scholars or scholars interested in women and gender issues in the context of sustainability and climate change. And we have done a couple of research studies, and we're collaborating with different people. And I'm going to present two of the research studies that we've been doing to show you some of the results. But if you are interested, it's an open network. We are on Facebook, and Kate can give you more information about how to be involved. So really, what we are interested in here now, today, is what is that issue space? So if we think about climate change and gender as an issue space, what is it? What's part of it? What's not part of it? What are the specific frames? How are things connected? So are different frames salient in different spheres? So the social media versus the news media. And then I also did a little bit on the NGOs I can show and Fortune 1000. So, but then also we have done some research as well that asked scientists and then also activists about how they think about this issue space. So study one is really a qualitative study of how sustainability activists and scientists frame the contributions that women can make to the climate change debate and the challenges that women leaders face in this kind of general issue space. And so far we have 78 respondents from all sorts of walks of life and being present at different meetings. So we did some research at Rio Plus 20, in Doha. Kate and Gillian collected data in Brazil and Peru. So I would actually like you to be part of that research, if you don't mind. You don't have to. But Kate brought some of the questionnaires because I thought it would be interesting for you to fill it out, and then I will show you what these other people have said. And we would love to hear what you are thinking in this kind of, what are the issues, what are the contributions, why should we, or should we not, think about, so don't let this distract you from what you want to write. We'll see if that corresponds to what you were saying. So starting with the challenges for women leaders, what we heard a lot is that people were saying, well, it's a man's world, and by that they mean there are certain values that are prominent. So for example, it's all about economic progress, And it's hard to frame this gender and climate change issue because that's not about economic development. And it might actually mean that resources are taken away from the economically important people and given to the women. And so making that justification is an issue. They were also talking about a lot of discrimination. That as a woman, if you want to talk climate change and actually organize around it and be a leader in that context, then you will face discrimination. The stereotypes in terms of, well, it's women and they're more emotional, and so really they're not contributing facts to the discussion here. There's a huge issue in women just in generally being underrepresented, so that makes it harder for other women to talk about climate change if not a lot of women actually are there. Even if they're there, their voices are not often not heard, or they're not being taken seriously. Women actually don't necessarily have access to the tables where climate change is being discussed. And sometimes it's just also a lack of financial resources. This reminds me of Texas A&M. I was at a train. Just drive by during my class. Lack of financial resources, so women can't necessarily travel to meetings where climate change is being discussed. They lack the mobility, they lack the resources for transportation to pay for it. Women often really don't know about climate change. We were in Jeju at the IUCN meeting, and I still remember the story that they were telling. They did some research on the effects of climate change on women, and go to the website because they have a report on climate change in women. And some of the things that they found out was that, for example, I think it was in Ecuador, somewhere, there was a big storm, tropical storm hurricane coming. And the media were talking about 180 kilometer per hour winds. So I guess for you guys that also doesn't mean much, whatever that is in miles. But for the women, that really didn't mean anything because most of them had never been in a car. They didn't know how fast that was. And so they really didn't. They heard the news, but they really couldn't interpret it. They didn't have the schema that allowed them to interpret that warning. And then a lot of women do have gender-specific roles and obligations, so they are supposed to be at home, taking care of the family, taking care of the household. They're not supposed to talk about climate change. They're not supposed to organize and meet other women or meet the decision makers and be politically active. And then there's also a lot of lack of role models for women to really say, oh, I want to be like this, I want to fight for my community, or I want to be engaged. Because here's a woman, I could do the same. So in terms of contributions, they said that it's really important to include women in the climate change debate and to acknowledge that there is a gender issue related to climate change. Not only are women more affected, so that's what IUCN has been doing in their research. Another story they told was that, for example, in Bangladesh, a lot of more women die in flooding events than men because the women are not allowed to leave the house without the permission of the male household head. So they stay at home and they drown. So it's important to bring these women into the conversations. They have a different perspective, and people people were saying that women do have a different time horizon. They often think about the next generations, maybe a more holistic view of things. And because they work more in the fields, they're responsible for collecting the water. They just take care of the children. They have a more direct and grounded experience of the effects of climate change, and can bring that into the debate. It's just that also women are women, and they might see things in a different way, and they have different approaches in terms of how decisions are being made and how they organize. They do certain things better. They also prioritize other things, and here again, they were saying things like, okay, for them, maybe, not for all women, but for many women, maybe economic progress is not the ultimate goal, so there's other goals. They do have certain authority in terms of educating children about climate change, so they are important decision makers and gatekeepers also. They have a certain knowledge and awareness, for example, of local plants and animal species that maybe the men don't have in like traditional cultures. The women worry more about, I don't know, the mushrooms in the forest or whatever. And other people were saying, well, maybe women, it's not a different perspective or not really a gender issue, but it's better to have a lot of people talking about climate change. So even if you don't believe that there is a gender-specific issue, you should encourage women to be part of the climate change debate because we need power in numbers. So does it kind of map up with what you had, or some issues that
How
you had?
how are the genders of your respondents
Mm-hmm.
splitting up?
Actually mixed, and we haven't done the split here in terms of gender, but that's also why we asked you about your gender, because we do want to see how that perspective differs. So that is in the works. I'm not presenting it today, but yeah.
Does that differ, do your results differ according to, third world countries versus first world, Western versus Eastern?
There are some comments, so not necessarily the respondents where they come from, but respondents being aware of different issues, and there are some comments that say, look, the issues in a third world country, and especially also a divide between urban and rural, that there are different issues that women are facing. And but at this higher level, they were still fairly, well, pretty much the same big categories of things that people were talking about. But there were a couple of people that specifically said, look, we cannot also not put all the women into one basket and say women have these issues, right? Mm-hmm. So there is a diversity of women out there, and so they, yeah. Good, so it will be exciting to see what you said. I'm moving on to study number 2, and this is more of a the social media kind of study, where we are working with a professor actually in Austria, and he's a computer scientist, and he has designed technology to basically crawl different spaces on the web and the social media sphere. And he's very passionate, and always has been, about environmental issues and climate change. So he has created a platform called Media Watch on Climate Change. And I also wanted to show it to you because it might be useful for some of the things that you're doing. So what he does, and he has done this for, I think, the last 6 or 7 years even, he's crawling the web. He has huge servers sitting at his university where he actually then stores the data. So crawls it fairly frequently. I mean, he's not Google, but has huge data, and does it specifically in this context for climate change. So he has built algorithms to identify which documents are actually related to this issue. And then has created tools that allow us to analyze this data in different ways. So what I'm going to present to you is just me playing around with the tool, doing different searches and seeing how that data actually appears. And I decided to do it post Rio Plus 20 to actually see, hey, what's been discussed in the last year. So here's the platform. It's open. It's ecoresearch.net. And then if you just click on Media Watch on climate change, then that will get you to the actual tools. But you see here that he's doing lots of different projects in this area and has lots of funding from the European Union, but also does actually a portal for what is it? The National Oceanic and Atmospheric, whatever. NOAA. Yeah.
Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Okay. So he has built a portal specifically for them because they are interested in crawling their issue space. They want to see how people talk about them because they're mostly known for their hurricane tracking. And they really would like the public to know a lot more about the services that they offer and have a different view of that. So I think there's also, he has some screenshots also of their, like if you click on partner organizations, you can see their portal as well. But that is a private portal. This one is open, you can play around with it. So, I mean, there's lots of different tools and complicated things. Here's just a general screenshot. I'm going to limit myself to just some of that. But you can even see where these sources are from. So he's crawling in this open platform only the English-speaking news media. He has a German portal as well, but that's different. He has built algorithms to also analyze the sentiment of these sources. So red is negative, green is positive. And it allows you then also to see the actual sources, so you can go into the source and then see, okay, where is it actually coming from? Why is there a peak up there and why not? And then it also looks at the semantic relationship of the words, so we're going to have a look at that. So for example, he has done some general comparisons of the sentiment across news media, social media, and the Fortune 1000 companies. Remember, green is positive, and you see here that Fortune 1000 companies frame climate change actually as an opportunity. It's an investment opportunity. They're doing good, they're saving energy, they're building all this stuff that will help us overcome climate change issues. Whereas you see here, the social media space is a lot more red than, for example, also the news space. And see here in general, energy is one issue that really, the salient thing that people talk about a lot on the news. So climate change debate is still, and sustainability is still very much focused on saving energy. All right, so now here the recent stuff, and I guess we'll see how much you can see actually. So this is the last year, just specifically climate change and how much is actually being reported on climate change. And you can see here there's definitely, actually right after Rio Plus 20, not much discussion of it, which I think is kind of scary. And then you have these peaks, and if you clicked on the portal, you can see here, I don't know why, but June 28, Obama was talked about a lot. But then in Australia, we had the Julia Gillard, Kevin Rudd kind of issue during that time. And so that was a big thing because she is associated with the carbon tax. And so that's why a lot of news media were reporting. And you see here in kind of like the general space, news media, it's more about sea level changes, whereas the social media are more about Obama, climate change science, you know, is it really fact, or is it, what are the reports out there? So there are some differences. All right, so if we look at this general issue space and sentiment in social media, this is the recent one, it does kind of go with what he had before. It's a lot about talking about denial, a lot about issues, not so positive, but a lot of different kinds of issues. I'm not sure actually why Colorado, but I guess flooding, fires, all of that really came up here. If you just look at gender, but remember these are documents that are seen as relevant to sustainability and climate change, but just gender in general, you get a lot of just very general gender stuff like discrimination, empowerment, harassment, Julia Gillard, big issue. Not very specific to climate change at all. And I guess it is because it's just maybe mentioned in connection with climate change a little bit somehow. I mean, as I said, Gillard in connection with the carbon tax. So if we look at climate change and gender in the news media, here's what we get. So a mix of positive and negative, and I don't know if you've actually heard of balanced reporting and how news media always try to have a balanced view of facts, and it's actually sometimes not so good because they kind of almost force themselves to bring in another opinion, because just reporting one opinion would be seen as unbalanced. So if they report on climate change, they also have to feature a climate change skeptic, right? That's their view of how they should be reporting. Yeah, I don't know, I didn't find this particularly engaging or interesting. Again, gender and Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd, big things here. If we look at the connections between concepts, again you see Gillard here in the center. You see a lot about a little bit, I guess, development of gender, discrimination, but all sorts of things. Specifically with gender and climate change search, then at least you get more of the security conference, domestic, but still not, really not a very defined space and not very interesting space. So if that's really the picture out there, I don't think people are getting a lot about gender and climate change really from the news media. If you look at the NGOs, different picture. I think it's more about development, mitigation. I think a little more positive. At least I have the feeling that it's more green here. So really development, education, it's okay, what can be done, what needs to be done, social issues related to that. And then again, specifically searched for the exact terms, but again, equity, but also no issue stands out. So there's no clear framing of the main issue. So it's all of these things are just floating around there. So visually, not one thing that we could key on. And you see that here too, kind of complex, all sorts of things being discussed. Poverty, justice, civil rights and all that. Fortune 1000, just a general gender search, very much just framed as diversity, a general diversity issue, that's it. If you look specifically at gender then, not very different, I guess a little bit about more including equity and disasters, but again, nothing stands out. And same picture here, it's about equality, employment, affirmative action, what do we have here in the governance, those kinds of issues being presented in the company websites and reports. All right, so then social media. What do we see here? More about food security, degradation, so resource issues, power, poverty, also more balanced, I think, more red and green than in the other issues, but still not a lot of big issues, so a big space, big issue space. Climate and gender here now specifically. Now we actually also see the specific meetings where that was discussed. So we see more of that in the social media sphere happening. I don't know if Kate can share the presentation if you want to have a look at the specific concepts, but just visually again, I think there is a more balanced view, and there's definitely different issues discussed in the social media sphere. So here's your Twitter, your Facebook, your blogs that really talk about this. So you don't see it framed as diversity. So clearly different from the Fortune. So here's just the relationships again, and it's hard to take screenshots of that. It's a very interactive system, so if you go to the platform you can explore some of these nodes in more detail. But you see here again, food security, agriculture, food policy, adaptation, COP18, United Nations equality, those issues really weren't that present in the other sources. So I think that really shows us that social media is quite different. So we are running out of time, but I would like to leave you with my opinions and hear yours if you have time for a couple minutes. I think it's a very complex issue space. That's my conclusion from all that data. So it's not so clear what gender and climate change really is about. There's different frames that are presented, but not a lot of very big salient issues. It's not clear who is really represented in the social media sphere, so I think we have to be careful with interpreting the social media data, because we don't know who's posting. It's not just consumers posting, it's not just community leaders posting. There's definitely also companies posting in the social media sphere, so we should be careful in terms of interpreting that. But I think it still shows us that there is a difference between news media and social media, and that if people are more exposed to social media nowadays, maybe there's an opportunity for them to get exposed to some of the other concepts. But if they're not very salient and not very prominent, I think that is a challenge. So of course, as a researcher, I have to conclude we need to figure out how this really comes about. And we actually are doing some work also on the social network issues and the attendance of specific meetings, and whether that leads to a more common or shared issue space. That if you go to meetings like the COPs, or if you were at Rio Plus 20, whether you have a common understanding now of the issue. So how important are these gatherings of people? I mean, thousands of people come together at these meetings, and does it really make a difference? So, unfortunately, I guess gender issues not much represented in the media in terms of interesting stuff. Not clear what we should be thinking about. So hopefully our research will shed some light on why that is and how we could change. Thank you. And the university is just 10 minutes.
Time for questions?
Yeah, or if you would like the presentation, happy to, yeah.
What is the timing of this grant? I mean, what is now the process?
There's actually several grants that are, so the Global Women Scholars Network is a network grant. So it's not a research project being funded, but it's, or I guess Gillian can jump in here. It's initial funding to get together researchers to then apply for other grants and to gather people who are interested in this space. So we have a couple of spin-off projects now. How many do we actually have? Three. Yeah. So I think the plan is to have this continue. Yeah, the GWSN grant itself is 3 years or
5 years. So it's the main grant's a 5-year grant. It spins off, we have 2 2-year grants, which specifically look at women in sustainability and women in climate change to see what is the issue space, where is it, and what are some of the differences. And the second aspect is how social media, as she mentioned, actually play into how women network together.
Yeah.
What are the networks behind climate change? And one of the things that Uli didn't mention that has really sort of inspired us to go into this work is if you just think about the issue when you were doing your little essay, all these things pop into mind that you hear from the advocacy side, and it's not clear that there's been any research on how those issues actually then transform into the space. So part of that interesting really disconnect is you have the advocacy saying one thing, but yet when you search media or you ask people their points of view, you get a different set of issues. So there's, like Uli said, this mixture of issues is really interesting because you have one group advocating, but yet that doesn't seem to be the overall picture. So how do you put that together where the social media brings everyone's voice to the table at once? It's a real interesting sort of...
But I think in compared to like the overall arguments that the climate change issue space or debate in general lacks scientific fact, I mean it's clearly the case in the gender space. So it's definitely more about advocacy. I guess that's also why the IUCN felt like they really had to compile some actual data on the effects of climate change on women, because people were talking about it, but there's not a lot of fact on it.
So basically,
Sorry.
the research grant is not limited like for media studies. It can be
No.
like
It's
anything like-
actually Gillian is the PI.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And we have a computer scientist on board, so it's not limited to women and it's not limited to a specific discipline. I think it's people who are interested in this issue space and come from it. And that's the beauty of it. Look at this from different angles. And we also have worked with the IUCN, so it's not only scientists that's why we call it Scholars Network, because we define scholar as more broadly someone who's either producing or using data. We have an NGO called Climate Wise Women, as part of the grant as well.
So I was curious if, so you mentioned at the beginning looking at sort of these organizations, boundary organizations, news media that can filter and kind of shape these, the framing, but also the issue space. You mentioned the rural or urban rural, and has there been any work that looks at, because where I work, some of the research that we do looking at gender distinctions with knowledge and valuation of ecosystem services, some of the stuff the interesting juxtaposition of these kind of merging spaces, these different forms. So in places like Ethiopia, where we work, or also in with interior Alaska tribes, there's still that kind of issue framing still in part comes from an oral tradition or gatekeepers that are individuals that can sort of frame what in other areas Twitter or newspapers or other media outlets might. But then there's this confluence of now this surge of jumping ahead to new media platforms. So when I was in Alaska, I had probably the dumbest phone out of anybody there. So you have all these people that are locked into that space, but there's still, it's kind of these overlaps of these very different gatekeeping kind of issue framing. And I'm just wondering if that, if anything's being looked at on that, or your thoughts on that.
So I look at it only from, I guess, what's out there, but I think what you're saying is it's now actually, the question is, does it have real effects now that the general accessibility that technology provides, does that actually really help change opinions or frame issues in certain ways, or is it still not enough, or are the women still not accessing the technology as much as men, or are there still the sources they use, are they still not really talking about this?
Is it allowing that integration of that local, that gender knowledge, but also that local traditional forms of knowledge that are still very salient in those places to come into a new?
So no, I don't know of any concrete studies, but some anecdotal evidence that we've heard in meetings that it is now a little easier for women to organize. And I guess that's the same with the Middle Eastern political revolutions, where it's just getting together is easier if you have a mobile phone and you can coordinate and you can also share things more easily. But no, I think you should do some research on that. I think
There's some great data on the Pew Research Center. The Pew data just recently published on smartphone use and cell phone use, and found that just in America, who uses smartphones and how they use them is very different by race and gender and economics. So interesting enough, if you look at climate change, the people who are most engaged in climate change tend to be middle class, upper middle class white women. If you look at who uses social media the most, it's lower class black women. So here you have an issue space where the climate change is talked about more in the social media, but the group that lists itself most concerned doesn't use that same media. So it's actually really a fascinating what happens with these issue spaces as suddenly this access changes, where on your phone you get news, you get this, you get whatever, and you know what your buddies are talking about. And that phone use is not the same for everybody. So different groups use the phone and use the features of the phone differently. And just being aware of that tells us how the issue space around climate change will shift on how that knowledge is passed on.
Well, in China, I do a lot of research in China, especially social media in China. And in China, that's really the only way they get any kind of real information. They're very aware of that because everything else is government sanctioned, and even the social media space is watched by the government. But they have, actually some platforms allow them to be anonymous. So you don't have to put in a name, you don't have to put in an address or phone number. So that is really their space to talk about environmental issues. So I think, just very interesting opportunities.
Thank you.